this morning we're starting a series of 6 interviews with Roy Madron, who's bringing out a new book which is called Super-Competent Democracies, Dissolving Neoliberalism, Elitism and Managerialism. Good morning, Roy. I think setting the scene as a first question, I wanted to start our discussion with the first correspondence we had back in 2011 when I wrote to you, having looked at your Guyane Democracies website. I wrote this. I followed some links off the BBC Economics page which led me to your website. I've become more and more alienated from the political system in the UK and the seemingly never-ending separation of the interests of the community from what government seems to support. And then I go on to say, like so many others, I wonder where the change is going to come from that will allow our children and theirs to grow up in a free world rather than some Orwellian nightmare. I will point others in your direction who are also struggling to make sense of it all. So what was it that causes that alienation?
First of all, somebody like yourself, who's a responsible, cares about the future, intelligent, knowledgeable, and so on, must be frustrated in not having a way of making a contribution to the way society is being, the direction in which society is going, and the way it's going there. Because essentially that has been taken away. That you can vote at an election, if you feel so inclined, for increasingly similar classes. And from the 1980s onwards, essentially, from the late 1980s onwards, essentially there was no choice in the UK, at least, between the two major parties at the level of economic policy. Both were pursuing a quasi-neoliberal, market-based policy. That the answer to the world's problems was in freeing up the market, getting the government, getting the state off the back of entrepreneurs, allowing individual creativity and enterprise to flourish. And the smaller the state, the better it would be. One of the leading neoliberal Americans said that his idea was to reduce the state to the size where you could drown it in a bathtub, which is extraordinary. But that's the sort of thing that for you was happening and is happening outside the normal debate that you come across in newspapers or on TV or wherever. So you don't get the chance to actually see what's happening beneath the surface. That's the first thing. The second thing is that in terms of the title of the book, Super-Competencies, I've titled it that because in fact we have a real problem of how do you manage the huge complexity of the dilemmas that we're facing. And again, you will have seen that the responses to climate change and pollution and all that sort of thing have got worse and worse and worse. They've actually made things worse rather than better. And that's a sort of incompetence which is beggars belief. And then you look at the Amazon and Africa and Asia and rainforest and the oceans. All of that seems to be getting worse and worse and worse. And that's again partially to service the whole neoliberal project, partially because there is no shared competence, levels of competence and understandings of how to deal with those hugely complex issues, and so some hero is put forward to manage it, to solve all these problems, whereas in fact they're not solvable by conventional managerial methods. So, and again, these are not issues which are discussed out in the open, as it were. And almost all the philosophical, theoretical, ideological basis on which your understanding of the world would have been based are now more or less obsolete. Plato is no use to you, Marx is no use to you for really moving forward into a new world. So no wonder people are alienated. And I've been lucky enough to be working over the last 40 years with people who are in the business of understanding and managing hugely complex systems. And this is what we're faced with, and we need to apply that understanding and share that understanding with people like yourself in order that we can build ways in which the human family can learn how to become increasingly sustainable, increasingly just, increasingly democratic over the next few generations. Does that make sense?
It does. I've also got the advantage of having been able to read the book and seen it broken down into the different areas, almost a theory of everything.
Yes. We need that.
Yeah, so in the layout of the book, Roy, it starts off with an introduction which is entitled Meet the Combatants. Who are the combatants?
Yeah. Okay, neoliberalism has been basically the dominant way of running governments since the 1980s. From Thatcher to Reagan to Clinton to Blair and Brown and Campbell and all the rest of them, Bushes and so on. They are essentially neoliberal ideologues that they have handed over. They're increasingly trying to reduce the role of the state, to privatize, to bring the private sector in to run public services on a market basis. The notion that the market is the solution to everything. So that has been the reason behind why so much of our crown jewels, as it were, have been handed over at an enormous loss to the public purse to private business, the railways, etc., etc. And that process started to be felt much more painfully in Latin America, where the problems of the state were compounded by the policies imposed upon the state by organizations like the World Bank and the IMF, the so-called structural adjustment programs, which essentially said you can't pay pensions, you can't pay unemployment benefit, you can't have a public service hospital system. You've got to hand over that to incoming corporations. And from about the end of the 1980s, in Latin America, there was a movement against neoliberalism. They recognized what it was. Mm-hmm. It wasn't Thatcherism. It wasn't just a name. It was an ideology. And in fact, what you call a theory of everything. It was a theory of economics, of government, of human relationships, of everything, based upon the notion that the market has the answer. So, from about the early 1990s, in Latin America, governments in Venezuela and Bolivia, Brazil, elsewhere, have been trying to find an alternative to neoliberalism. And they have thought of it in terms of a sort of 21st century version of socialism. Mm-hmm. Except for the fact that that doesn't work either. Mm-hmm. So they're trying to find an answer, but they're looking in the wrong place. And so what really is needed to combat neoliberalism is a wholly new way of thinking about the way we manage our societies. Because in fact, neoliberalism is right in the sense that the current systems that we have do not enable us to tackle effectively the huge problems, complexity of the problems that we face. But on the other hand, nor does socialism and the super-competent model that I put forward is about using liberating leadership, shared purposes and principles, management cybernetics, participative systems change, and others as part of a democratic dialogue as an ensemble of super competences that will enable our societies to become increasingly just, increasingly sustainable, and increasingly democratic. Mm-hmm. That's the important thing at every level. So that's really the purpose. So we are in direct opposition to neoliberalism, but also most ideas about conventional ideas about socialism, since they're highly centralized and depend upon some super socialist hero to extract you from the current mess. So it's a way of that we can't get out from under neoliberalism by going back to anything that was happening before. Mm-hmm. We have to move forward into a new era altogether.
How would you describe cybernetics to someone who comes across it for the first time, Roy?
Yeah. Well, it's the study of how viable systems work. Mm-hmm. Whether it's a human or whether it's an ecological system, anything which has whether it's a fish or it's an amoeba or whatever.
Yeah.
Or whether it's a company. That when you came across cybernetics, the term cybernetics, it kind of set you back, and you think, you know, that's really not where we want to be, is it? We want to be more human, not more technological, as it were. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. I mean, the cybernetics thing, it kind of set off a connection in my head with technocracy.
Yeah.
Is that it's an X. Do you remember those famous TV adverts with Maureen Lipman saying, "Oh, you've got an ology, that's very good." It's an X or an ology and not an ism.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean, because
yeah.
You don't want people to worry about, well, this is a cybernetic system, and people immediately will start to think, well, we're talking about politics here, and we're talking about systems of government, and here we have this cybernetics which we haven't heard about before. Okay, it's a science of
is it dehumanizing or rehumanizing?
Yeah, well, and is it democratic?
The cyborgs and things like that.
Yes, is it democratic? You know, how do we tell, you know, how do we tell the Frankenstein's monster what it's been designed for, and that it does that sort of thing?
Yeah. Hence, I call this super-competences. Mm-hmm. That in fact it's not something that we want to get hung up on old ways of responding. The most powerful way of thinking about the complex issues that we're facing, especially neither left nor right nor green.
Well, I think that's to bring out of it.
There's a thing which you've got to get into our shared starting point, as it were. And it's something that Stafford Beer wrote in the 1990s called A World in Torment. Mm-hmm. And Stafford said, you know, things are getting worse and worse and worse, and there's real. It's not just people are having a hard time; it's that in fact they're in agony.
Yeah.
That and the the Soviet system has broken down, and the capitalist system is on the way to breaking down. Mm-hmm. And to the to politicians and political scientists and commentators and so on, they're supposed to be very different systems. But in fact, they're the same system in a different guise. And the system that they have is excessive centrality. Mm-hmm. They try to organize things from the center.
Yeah.
And those are doing that is to break the fundamental law of cybernetics, which says that you have to create systems which enable you to respond to the variety of demands outside. To be viable, you've got to be capable of constantly adjusting and managing and responding to the complexity of the demands that are made on you by the environment and also by your internal complexity.
The important thing to realize about systems is how they are controlled. And we must get rid of any notion straight away that control is something imposed on the system from outside. It has to be built into it. Now, you saw me operate this governor just now and noticed how the engine slowed down. Let's see how the mechanism works. Suppose the engine is racing, then the governor flies open like that. You see it lifting here, transmitting the message along here, lifting that cam up here, and then shutting off a valve there. That is built into the system. It's called feedback, and feedback is ubiquitous in control systems.
Our governments seem to be so incompetent is that they simply don't grasp that.
Mm-hmm.
They go for the great thinkers at the center. We bring in the czar for this, or the expert for that, or this brilliant young Barack Obama as the new president. And that's all centralizing instead of distributing decision-making power and knowledge and shared understanding and purpose.
Yeah.
So the reason I called this a super-competent democracy is that it's a different kind of and a different order of competence and a different model of competence than that which we have at the moment.
Yeah. That makes sense.
A moment to kind of reflect on this idea about the great diversity and lack of common assumptions and experience of the people who find themselves in opposition to neoliberalism without knowing that it's neoliberalism that they're in opposition to.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think that's almost a starting point that reflects on your experience and mine too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because when the first question you asked me was, why am I, how come that I felt so powerless and detached from everything that was going on? It was something like that.
Alienated.
Why is that? It's because what you didn't know is that you had an enemy which didn't have a name.
Yeah.
Which you didn't have a name for.
Yeah.
And there are hundreds of millions of people in your situation who didn't know that they had this enemy, and didn't know that they were on the same side, because they came from very different backgrounds, very different education, very different experience, very different knowledge, very different situations, and so on. Very different forms of attack.
Yeah.
But the purpose of this series, then, if you like, is to give all of those people a way of fighting back against this enemy, which didn't have a name, which we now know is something called neoliberalism.